Mary Claire is a force of nature. She's an amazing human, a wonderful person. I cannot say how much I've enjoyed getting to know her over the past year and a half. I love following her, where she's going and around the world, literally around the world, all by train. She's inspired me to buy a Eurail pass to go back to what I did 35 years ago. But really trying to bring climate advocacy and negotiating and the power of voice and the power of dialogue and intergenerational dialogue to all of us. And it is a really great pleasure and an honor to invite you to host the next dialogue. Mary Claire.
Now you can take a little break.
Yeah, go.
Wonderful. So we are going to spend the next 30 minutes to talk about water access and accessibility. What does water mean to us? What is our personal connection and access to water? But also how my three incredible guests are actually creating more access to water. Let me start with that access to water is a fundamental human right. So everyone has a right to access water and actually clean water. Yet this is of course not globally guaranteed, as we heard yesterday and as we all know. Additionally, we have a very unfair distribution, both in the right to actually access the water and in the water access itself. Globally, we have an increase in water demand, yet we see a decrease in the quality and quantity of the water, especially the clean water. And as Chris already mentioned, as a climate change advocate, I have to mention that the climate crisis currently is putting an unprecedented pressure on water access on a global scale. Also here in Switzerland, also in Italy and countries, we didn't know this before. So it's not only a topic which is of concern to people very far away. Also, as Chris mentioned, I'm working a lot in decision making, and as well there, we see that young people, women, people of color, indigenous people, are not represented when we talk about the access to water, when we talk about the fundamental right on how people are accessing water. Very often these groups are absent from decision making, yet they're the ones who are carrying the biggest burdens when it comes to water accessibility. As well, there's water, but there's also sanitation, and we're going to talk about both in the next couple of minutes. And why we are going to talk about this with our three wonderful guests, which I'm going to call on stage in a second, I would like you to close your eyes for 10 seconds and think about what is your personal connection to water? What is your access to water? Have you ever been deprived from accessing water? And how did this feel? What did this do to you? And with this, I would like to call my three guests, Joe, Imani, and Christopher, to me on stage. We also get some gadgets here on stage while I'm introducing my three wonderful dialogue partners here on stage. So Joe is a water storyteller. She was working in aviation and traveled the world and really saw the problems of access to water, and this really impacted her. And basically you took the decision to become a water advocate, a water ambassador, and a water storyteller, really influencing also especially local politics and also especially the access for girls. Mm-hmm. Then we have Imani, who came all the way here from the United States, and she is an Afro-American oyster farmer, and she's the only female oyster farmer I know. And this is also what she's advocating for women in aquatics, and especially also for minority and people of color. And I think it's absolutely incredible what you're doing, and you're going to talk about your organization in a second. And then we have Christopher, who is working, or who worked also with the Red Cross and the EAVAG, and is really increasing water access for the ones, for the people most vulnerable, the ones in the refugee camps, and brought us some gadgets of his work with us. But as I asked you before, I would like to start with the three of you. So what is your personal access? What is your personal connection? How did you get interested in the topic of water? And let's start with you, Jo.
Well, I guess in the beginning, I would say I was an outsider in the water community and the water industry, because you're not working in water utility or you're not part of development work. And in fact, I was an airline hostess, and we get to travel for free, so that's really cool. And I just get to go to incredible places. And in 1 week, I would always say on the dinner table that I will be in Sweden, for example, where you get to choose sparkling or still, and next day I will be in some parts of the world where you don't even, when you open the bottled water, it smells. And you question, this happened to me in a span of 1 week. So I guess with a lot of introspection, you try to ask yourself, what am I doing? And why am I receiving this information? And what do I do with this information? And so, like any other confused millennial, and what you're gonna do with your life, you go back to your hometown. And you ask your colleagues in your inner circle, and you see that, in fact, there's a lot of work to be done. And like probably many of us here who traveled and did a significant travel in our lives, you see that it changed you. As cheesy as it sounds, this will actually transform how you see the world, wherever industry you're in. So for me, it was really traveling and seeing and meeting really cool people like everyone here in this room. So, but in the Philippines too, water means the lack of water and abundance of water means two things. Like it's death and it's also life, because when the monsoon season comes around, there's a lot of water. And growing up in the Philippines, where one storm, your island gets swept away, and in the city, you get to swim in electrocuted water because the poles are down, etc. So water means life and death, although we all know that it's life, but in some parts of the world, it also means death with abundance or lack of water. So,
Thank you
thanks.
so much, Joana, for talking about your personal access. Imani.
Yeah, I think mine is kind of similar, I would say, just having two sides to my relationship with water. I grew up in a coastal community, so I was surrounded by water. All of our traditions are within seafood and just having that relationship with the water growing up. But living in my small town, it was like always my goal to kind of leave that hometown, and there was nothing for me there. I needed to venture out. So when I left for college, I thought I wanted to be a tropical biologist, but then I got back into oysters as the universe would have it. And then when I came back home, I was devastated, but I realized that I had my own adult roots in water, that my history as far as my family being watermen on the waterways since the 1800s, it's in my bloodline. So water for me is not only is it peace, but it's also connection, it's also history, and that's like one of the biggest things that I really want to share about my relationship, is that you learn so much from your ancestors, and you learn so much about going out onto the bay, going to where they've gone, but it also being changed in your own sort of way of this new era of fisheries in the area. So yeah, for me, it's just connection. It's who I am. It's something that I think is definitely a part of my DNA, obviously, but yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Christopher, tell us a little bit more about you, and you also have some special hobbies in connection to water.
That is very true, yeah. So You know, my mother actually, because I was thinking about you because you were telling us about your family, my mother actually grew up at the Swedish coastline next to the water and had a really strong connection to water, and she's a diving teacher as a hobby. And that's why I also grew up very close to the water. You know, every holiday we spent at the seaside somewhere, and with like 12 years I did my first diving certificate, and I was like scuba diving, and then I ventured into free diving. And that's what I do now as a lifestyle, I would even call it, not even just a hobby. So I do deep diving, I hold my breath and I dive as deep as I can, and I go to world championships and do that. So I'm like top 10 in the world, diving to 90 meters. That's one side.
Small flex right there.
Small flex, yeah.
Just to give you the
Just
context.
flexing a bit.
No, and then, so that's the one side, and the other side is I work at ERWAC, the Swiss Federal Institute of Aquatic Science and Technologies. Now I got it right. And there I work with sanitation in refugee camps mostly, and disaster areas, because I have a background with the Red Cross, working in disaster regions all around the planet. And I brought some props, which I'm going to introduce to you later. And that's basically my connection to water.
Wonderful, thank you so much. As I already mentioned in the beginning, there are two sides, like the personal connection and access to water, but all of you are doing wonderful work to actually increase the access and also work on the fundamental human right to access water. And I would love to spend a couple of minutes where you can share about your story and how you're increasing access to water. Joe, over to you.
So in my work, in my advocacy work, I came across an indigenous community in the south of the Philippines where there's still an ongoing conflict, and basically they're also refugees from the mountains. They have their own lands, and because of the conflict, they had to go to the flatlands, and they're not even registered in the census, as I would say. And I'm talking about people who have a different relationship with the environment, where they are sustainable, self-sustained, and victims of the Civil War. So when they go there, they are just made to deal whatever that they have to do and to live. And talking to the community through backpacking trips back and forth, I learned that there's no school, there's no policy that supports them to have access to clean water, or just even like a nice jerry can to collect water. And so I started to go to the local government units first and policymakers. And on top of that, there's a layer of the indigenous tribes, so you have to speak with the chieftains, and I was resonating with Imani because as a woman working in trying to, poke the policymakers, like, can we take a look at this community? It's a struggle to be listened to because of many different things, cultural aspect, being unmarried and going to their communities. What are you trying to bring us? So it's tough, but I think the first line to go to is the policymakers, because sanitation, of course, like after learning about everything in community work, policymakers in the local government units have the strong capacity to build resources and connect you with experts. So the first line is to go to the local government units.
Absolutely, thank you so much. And we will come later to one of your story from Pakistan. But first, I would love to learn more about your NGO, which is a baby of the COVID time. And you can also talk a little bit about the name, the MEI, and what you're doing and how you actually increase access to aquatic cultures.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was an oyster farmer in the Chesapeake Bay for about 6 years before 2020. And so I had absolutely, fell in love with the industry, was working out on, hatcheries, nurseries, and farms, the whole aquaculture process. And in that, I had never I'd worked with people of color before, but they were all in labor roles. So they were working on farms or, packing the seafood and things like that. And when I moved back to Maryland in 2017, I started working for the first privately owned shellfish hatchery in the state of Maryland as the hatchery manager. And in the beginning of 2020, I started asking myself of like, when is the last time I saw a person of color in a leadership role, like hatchery manager, farm owner, any of those roles? And I really couldn't think of anybody. And I started asking people just within aquaculture from all different ranges of experience, and no one could give me a concrete answer either. Just to kind of give you a context, there is only one minority-owned oyster farm in the entire state of Maryland. On the entire East Coast, there's only 3 minority-owned oyster farms, and there's only about 1 or 2 African-American women that are participating in aquaculture on the entire East Coast. So there's really no representation. So in 2020, I unexpectedly lost my job, and I was really frustrated with what I had experienced as a person of color and as a woman in aquaculture. And so I started a nonprofit, Minorities in Aquaculture. There's a little bit of a play there, MIA, Missing in Action. It wasn't intentional at first. It honestly came to me at like 6:30 in the morning on the way to work, and it just sort of, just happened. But yeah, in 2020 in July, just with all the diversity and inclusion talk, with the Black Lives Matter movement, I just was so moved by those conversations. And so I wanted to do something, and I wanted to step in that space because aquaculture, the only kind of relief or support that they were giving people of color in the industry was to talk about it in conferences and forums. And I just thought that it was just time just to do more action than talking. So it started off as me just trying to find other women of color, and now we're almost 2 years old, and we have over 90 members from all over the world, all women of color in all different sectors of aquaculture, finfish, shellfish, coral, kelp. And we all come together as a community and empower each other, because not knowing someone who looks like you in the industry so that you can relate to is limiting for women of color, or just women in general. And then kind of, with our programming, we have a career development program where we fully fund their journey, or we help them and support them as best we can in their journey to a viable aquaculture career, however that looks to them. So fully paid internships, fully paid conferences, certifications, captain's courses, water safety courses, all those things. We're really looking at the entire picture of access to water because, in the United States, 64% of African Americans don't know how to swim. So how can I ask a young African American who hasn't had a relationship with the water yet to come out on a boat with me and to consider a marine occupation? I can't. I have to meet them where they are. I have to understand what they've gone through culturally as a barrier and ethically, and I have to meet them there and support them in all the different aspects, not just financially. So really we're looking at expanding our definition of minorities, because I fully intend to have everybody understand where their food comes from. That's why I love aquaculture so much, because I truly think that is the future for our sustainable seafood. So just giving them that seafood nutrition, not just, understanding where fish come from, but how to order it in the store, like how to fillet it, how to cook it, just giving them that access, that food security, that food sovereignty that a lot of people of color don't have. So just kind of encompassing all of those things together.
Thank you so much for bringing us the aquatic culture a little bit closer, and also highlighting these inequalities you are facing and trying to address.
Yeah.
And also what I really love about all the 3 panelists, that they are looking at the access to water in a really holistic way. So there is no silver bullet solution here, and I'm really trying to grasp the whole ecosystem and work on all of it at the same time. And this brings me to Christopher, and I am so curious what he's going to tell us, but also what is he going to show us.
Show off.
But yeah, over to you.
Carry it.
Well, so for this panel discussion here, we were not supposed to bring PowerPoint presentations, so I had to rethink my whole strategy. No, I mean, it's one thing to talk about water access and to talk about how heavy it is to, carry a 20-liter jerry can of water, and it's another thing to actually have it in front of you and then try it out. So what I thought about was like, how do I visualize what these people go through? And I thought, well, maybe I just bring exactly the same things that the people have to deal with every single day. So in households where you don't have on-site water supply, in 8 out of 10 cases, it's women or girls that have to fetch the water. And just for you to get an idea what it means, I mean, they have to go to this water point, just so the people in the back see it a little bit, and they have to use this hand pump to pump that water out, and they use this usually like 15 or 20 liter jerry cans to then, this is actually full, to make it more realistic, to carry it home, which is super heavy, and usually it's not just around the corner. So in, oh, that was heavy.
Too early.
You see? It makes a difference, huh? So in refugee camps, or like in humanitarian aid, we have so-called minimum standards for humanitarian aid, and that means that there should be a minimum that we as humanitarian aid organizations provide to the people. And the minimum standard says a latrine should not be further away than 50 meters from a home, and the water point should not be further away than 500 meters. Now imagine, I mean, 500 meters is a long distance, and that's the minimum standard. Usually they're like way further away. And then here in Switzerland, or basically Central Europe, everywhere, we can just open the tap and we have flowing water. And that's basically this part, right? We don't have to care about anything of that. And then afterwards, we just go to the toilet, we press a button, and everything disappears and it gets flushed away, right? Now in a refugee camp, you usually have pit latrines, meaning it's a hole in the ground, you have a concrete slab on top of it, and you just do your business into that pit. And at one point, the pit will become full. Now, until roughly 2010, big aid organizations didn't really care about it. They went there, they built 600 latrines, they made some nice pictures, they printed a folder, showed it to the people, and were happy about it. And then we had cholera outbreak in Haiti. Lots of people died, and there was a rethinking now, like how can we improve, sanitation in refugee camps. And the reality is that very often, like in Cox's Bazar, in the world's largest refugee camp, where I just came back from last week, the reality is that once the latrine is full, you have sanitation workers that go there with a bucket and a string attached, and they just throw that into the latrine and empty the latrine with it, right? So this is a bucket full of shit then, basically, and then you have to transport that, hopefully, to a treatment plant and not just to the next river. And this just shows how complex such a sanitation system actually is, or like a whole water system, so to say, if we don't, that we here don't see, actually, right? And I also brought some pictures, which I will put up on the walls over there. One is showing a latrine with a hand pump in front of it, where people fetch the water that they use to clean themselves in the latrines or to bathe. One of them shows, it's actually a picture from last week, and I just snapped it while I was walking by. It's actually a small child having diarrhea next to a river. Usually I don't make pictures of people because I want to serve, protect their dignity, but this child was facing away, and it was such a strong image, I would say, because it shows like the problem very prominently. There's still more than 400 million people on this planet that are practicing open defecation. There's still 3.6 billion people that don't have access to safely managed sanitation. And, having clean water is one thing, but having a proper sanitation system is another thing. If you don't care about your sanitation, it's going to be very hard to clean the water afterwards, So that's something that people often forget. And the third image is an image which I really like. It shows a latrine that was painted by the community so that they have a bit more, we call it psychological ownership of this latrine, so that they actually feel that's their latrine, and you can actually see a small girl standing on top of the latrine. And for me, this kind of resembled an image of hope, like a look into the future, which hopefully would be brighter. And yeah, that's how I want to close my remarks.
Oh my God.
Thank you so much also for bringing all of this up here to the mountain. I think it deserves.
It's a big flex.
I have pamphlets. I have pamphlets
Sample
in my bag.
oysters,
Anybody
yeah.
want a pamphlet? It's not as great as this, but I have a pamphlet in my bag. Anybody?
Okay,
I
afterwards.
didn't come unprepared.
Also, after the presentation, this is going to be here, so you can actually try.
Yes, please.
And lift it. And actually, what you just mentioned, also kind of some memories when I was in Ghana. Actually, I supported a community also to catch water, and it was around 1 kilometer. And walking kind of in the evening or in the morning when it's still a little bit dark on this very uneven something called roads to catch the water. And so they had the only open pots, and I spilled half of the water. I was completely wet, and everyone laughed at me, and my neck hurt so much afterwards. So this is when I really realized that I'm not fit for purpose to actually carry water. And it's really, really heavy, so I can only encourage you to actually try it afterwards. But before we are opening to your questions, so get ready for our lovely speakers. You told me yesterday about the very pressing story from Pakistan, where access to water is actually not only limiting, in this case, girls from accessing water and the right to access water, but also, for example, the right to access education or the right to actually have an independent life or getting a job. And I would really love that you can quickly share this story with all of us.
Cool. So I'm glad that we had a chance to, except for Chris, we had a chance to talk yesterday. For
Because
missing
he
the
missed the
gondola.
gondola and he
Yeah.
hiked up all the way. That's why we couldn't find him in the morning to prepare, but he made it.
Yeah.
My alarm didn't go off, so I had to walk up 3 hours. And
Not as prepared.
Yeah,
Not as
no.
prepared.
today I made sure I don't
Not
have
as
to
prepared.
bring that up the mountain.
So we were trying to weave our common grounds, like what is our commonality, and in fact my current partner in development in Pakistan was my economy class passenger, and I just started to talk to him, and he started to tell me these stories, and like this little human connections. You shouldn't miss this because you'll never know what can come up with it. And it's just by listening to his story where he said he created a refugee school in Peshawar in Pakistan, and we had a long discussion on actually access to menstrual health hygiene, which in fact, if you tell this to people, like they usually cringe, or this is something we don't talk about. So I was sharing in the lunch and dinners where what do you do when you're faced with a wall of tradition and culture, and this is haram, this is something that we don't talk about even at home. But what do we do now with this girl who's not understanding what's happening in their body and not going to school? So this is a form of injustice, and we have resources in the global north to address this. And to start the conversation, you need the local governments who wanted to support it, other people who wanted to contribute to basically resources, and some people. The first knee-jerk movement would be let's donate sanitary pads. Everyone knows so we can get sanitary pads. But I was telling Imani yesterday, in human-centered design, we wanted to get the different key players, and I shared this to many yesterday, that we almost miss one part, that actually children don't wear underwear. They don't wear underwear, and boys and girls. And so if you just give them pads and like a Band-Aid solution, access to menstrual health hygiene will not work, and pain management, and connecting it with trying to get rid of, for example, sanitary pads, etc. They throw them in the river. So ecosystem degradation. So we're all interconnected in what we're doing. And I was telling to Chris that this is a great jerry can, because some of them, they use like just buckets and old plastic bottles. So this is like top class.
Definitely.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing this very important story, because as you probably also know, SG6 is not only about access to clean water, but also about sanitation. And this is a very important aspect of it. But now we would like to open up to your questions, and you can just raise your hand, and then someone will go around with the microphone.
We did such a good
First
job.
one
I was
gets
gonna say,
to- gets
We
to
have one
carry.
here.
The first one gets to carry the
Yeah.
to try
Thanks
the-
for breaking the ice.
Incredible presentation. Thank you very much. Very simply, what, for individually each one of you, is the biggest barrier that you've come up against in your experience?
Yeah. You want me? I guess, yeah, I can go. I feel like the biggest barrier that is common in the women that are in minorities and agriculture are probably two things. It's exposure, actually three things: exposure, community, and financial barriers. So when you don't see people that look like you every day, or when you're the only one that is your ethnicity or demographic in your workplace every day, it starts to bring you down. Like, you don't have like a sense of belonging in that space, or you don't want to have a viable career. So bringing all of us women together, understanding each other, connecting, that's been a huge thing. But also financial, understanding that you can have a viable career in the environment, in aquaculture, but also giving them, kind of taking that barrier out of the way so that you can just say, hey, go to this internship, don't worry about the stipend, don't worry about the housing, don't worry about field gear, whatever you need, just go and get the experience. A lot of women in general in fisheries don't have that, so that's been, I feel like, the biggest thing that we've been able to support for them.
It's actually interesting because I got that question in the gondola when I came up. So I'm prepared. No. No, actually, it raised a big question mark also because sanitation is such a huge field, and it's really context dependent, right? I feel if we look at refugee camps especially, in the past, we didn't really, how shall I say, excel in providing very contextualized situation that really, people can connect to. So meaning, we had 8 organizations building hundreds of latrines which were not fit for purpose because, for instance, they needed water for flushing. There was no water. They built men and women's toilet next to each other, which is not culturally acceptable. The toilets were facing towards Mecca, which is not religiously acceptable. Then people didn't have any connection, psychological ownership, right, with these toilets. Meaning, once the 8 organizations leave, there's no one caring about the toilets, no one cleaning them, and so on. So it's not like the technology itself is there. It's not a problem. We have hundreds of designs for toilets and user interfaces, so that's the toilet bowl and stuff, right? And everything. It's not just the technical part, it's also the social and cultural part. And I think we need to provide more contextualized solutions, which we come up with the community, if possible. Yeah.
Joe?
I guess in my experience, being in a different industry, and my industry specifically had this little glitters of glamour that, like you're supposed to look like this. You're boxed in a stigma, and they see you in a different light. So that also brought a lot of challenges, and also I was a youth advocate. I started quite young, and they don't want to take you seriously. You go to local government units, and they don't give a shit, So how do you navigate through that? And so you gotta hustle, right? Like, you pull yourself out there from people who don't want to listen to you, and go to other places. In my case, I went to all fashion events, I went to all art events, and actually I made very good partnerships.
Thank you so much also for bringing your human-centric values to this. There is plenty of time also to talk to these 3 incredible human beings afterwards, so join me in thanking them for all their work.
Flex. We should take a picture.
Come on.
We should take a picture.
You didn't say you were going to bring that. You could give us a heads up.
And with this, maybe you can just quickly close again your eyes, quickly, reflect on what you have heard, and maybe also think, how can you increase access to water in your community, with your position, with your advocacy, with your knowledge, How can you join these three amazing human beings here up on stage and support them in their mission? And yeah, there is time afterwards to connect, and with this, I would love to hand over back to Chris.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mary Claire. Beautiful job.
Thank you.
Wonderful. I've got to come over and oh my gosh. I'm just going to carry it over here and see if I can still breathe, right? This is the very, very sobering. I loved how you started off with the person of I haven't talked about water as both death and life, the lack of and too much. That's really interesting. And those little human connections which we're making here turn into big opportunities.